Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the latest GSHPA webinar, the next in our series. And today we have got David Boon and Steve Thorpe from the British Geological Society talking to us about the various tools that are available for sizing heat pumps and assessing ground conditions. And I won't go into it because I'm sure David and Steve will give a much better overview than I will. But I'm really looking forward to this one today. It should be really useful. As usual, it will be available on the GSHPA YouTube channel after this. So feel free to catch up or to tell other people about it. They can go and catch up as well. There will be opportunity for Q&A as usual. So if you have got questions as we go along, just put them into the group chat. I'll be keeping an eye on those and passing them on to David and Steve at the end of the session. And if you've got further questions after that, either you can get in touch with David or Steve or directly with us at the GSHPA. We're really happy to take any further questions after this. And just to say, next week we have another webinar, 1 o'clock. Edward Thompson from ISACS will be presenting on fiscal opportunities and heat pumps and how the difference in electricity and gas prices are holding back potentially the deployment of heat pumps and how we can overcome that, different ideas and theories around that. So that should be another really good session next week. So if you can join us for that, please do. So it's just coming up to 1:05. So yeah, just gone 1:05. So I'm going to now hand over to David and Steve, and just want to say thank you for volunteering to do this now. So over to you.
Okay, shall I start by sharing my screen, Dave, and then we can get started.
Right, that's good. I can see.
You can see that? Cool. Over to you then, Dave. You can kick us off.
Am I able to?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, let me just remote control. There you go. You should be able to fly by now.
Great. So thanks everyone for joining us on this lovely Thursday lunchtime. So this talk came out of a conversation we had with Bean and Chris about the kind of use of geological data and the role of geological data in designing resilient, efficient ground source heat pump systems. So, you know, as you'll all be aware, ground source heat pumps are a very effective, reliable, efficient, low CO2, safe way to heat and cool your home or business. So we thought it'd be useful just to remind users, particularly professionals who are probably watching this video, who design heat pumps on a daily basis, of the range of geological information and tools that we have from the British Geological Survey, and particularly to highlight new data sets, innovative things out there, and free things which you will like, and give you a quick demo of some of the key kind of data sets that we think might be useful to you. So I'm Dave Boon, and my colleague Steve Thorpe is sitting here with me. So I'm just trying to scroll to the next slide here. Okay. So we've got about half an hour planned for this first section, and then we'll have some Q&As at the end. So we're just going to cover with you, why do you want to consider geology in a ground source heat pump project? What BGS data is available to you? And we're going to give you an introduction to GeoIndex, which is our online data access portal that is going to be most useful to you, and sort of drop in some comments about some other sort of data sets that we've got. We will touch on 3D modeling data and an open loop screening tool that we've got online. And Steve's going to give us a quick intro to an exciting project called Dig to Share, which is all about unlocking subsurface data to help reduce risk for everyone involved with ground engineering projects, including ground source heat pumps. And he's also going to share with you some more advanced, just a quick example of some more advanced geomodeling tools for developing cross sections, which some of you might use on larger sites using a whizzy new bit of free software called Groundhog Desktop. So without further ado, yeah, so as a lot of you will appreciate, the ground source is in the ground, and for a successful heat pump design, we need to know a bit about our site. We need to know some knowledge of ground conditions. We need to know perhaps what the temperatures are in the ground seasonally, which could fluctuate in the top sort of 10 meters seasonally, but below that they should be quite stable, which is why they're a very, very reliable heat source, using that coupled with heat pumps. We need to know something about the geology, the soil types, the thermal properties of the soils and rocks, something about the hydrogeology sometimes, particularly for open loop schemes, which John Finlay gave us a very good talk on a couple of sessions ago. We need to know about understanding about drilling hazards, such as are we going to have artesian water cast, voids in the ground, old mines, ground instability is a problem with sort of slope instability in the site, or old mines, soil contamination, and even unexploded ordnance in some parts of the country, particularly some cities. So the BGS, we've been around a while. We were established in 1835, and we are the nation's principal supplier of subsurface data and information. So I say data and information because they're different. Data is numbers on a spreadsheet. Information is interpreting that into something that's usable and understandable and useful. So we provide paper geological maps, which we're probably best known for, and increasingly we've been developing digital data, which is great because you can incorporate it in GIS systems, web map services, 3D PDFs. So we're going to show you an example of our web map service, GeoIndex, and how to use it. Borehole records of previous drilling, which is really useful information for people going into an area and trying to work out what's in the ground. 3D models, technical reports, thematic layers. So some of the layers we produce are things like, we actually produce a GS data layer called superficial thickness model, which is the thickness of the superficial, or we used to call it drift, so kind of glacial or riverine deposits on top of bedrock. So if that's variable across a site, then you know, this map might give you a first indication of kind of how variable and how that might affect your kind of drilling plans or your excavation. So we've also got a screening tool for larger open loop ground source heat pumps, and I'll sort of show you an example of that. And we offer a GeoReport service, which is basically a geologist sits down and writes a report based on the site. So it provides a borehole prognosis. So this is an anticipation of the geological formations and how thick they are, up to maybe the top couple hundred meters or whatever the project requires. You can kind of add on hydrogeological expert modules onto that. So a hydrogeologist will look at all the data in the area and forecast what the expected yields might be in water chemistry with available data. We'll give an estimation of thermal properties of those materials and the average thermal properties, the thermal conductivity and diffusivity, particularly within the area of the bulk area of interest for your closed loop system, and an overview of sort of drilling and geohazards that might be sort of associated with that local area. So we also do some research into shallow geothermal energy, or geothermics at BGS. We look at shallow geothermal, which I would call anything less than 400 meters. Some people call it low enthalpy geothermal. We also look at deep geothermal energy, and we're not going to touch on that really today. So we look at energy storage potential, source temperature surveys from a city scale to a sort of borehole scale. Even on it, we produce maps at a national scale as well. We have projects for people looking at the microbiology of critters down in boreholes, and we do some monitoring of system performance on schemes to look at how the geology and the use of the scheme impacts the long-term thermal temperature and interaction between schemes underground. We have capability in thermal and mineralogical properties analysis, mostly on cores. And we run the UK GEOS experimental field research site, which has got an exciting new initiative. There's 2 sites actually, one in Cheshire and one in Glasgow. And we also link up with an urban geothermal kind of research area in Cardiff, which is the picture of my colleague Gareth Farr monitoring some boreholes that we do regularly around Cardiff to look at the ground temperatures in an urban environment. So yeah, there's quite a lot of research opportunities coming up with this UK GEOS site, and I've left some links there for you to go back to on the slides later on to find out more about those. We also engage with international research networks such as the IEA's Heat Pump Technologies Group, which have annual meetings, which are really great places to network and look at what other researchers and industry are doing. We are involved with a European project that investigates shallow urban geothermal resources called MUSE, which involves 14 different European geological surveys, and we're all sharing data and expertise in monitoring across 16 urban pilot areas around Europe. We also engage with a new cost action called Geothermal DHC, which is a research network for including geothermal technologies into decentralized heating and cooling grids, and that's it's got probably a couple of 100 members already. And if you're interested in joining, you can join for free, and you can get in touch with me about how to do that. And also Brit Geothermal, but that's more of a focus on deep geothermal research. So I want to hand over to Steve, and kind of together we're going to run you through some of the key data sets that we think are useful for ground source heat pump design from BGS. Free stuff.
Thanks, Dave.
So Steve, do you want to take
Yep. I'll carry on from here. So yeah, so this is this next section just looks at the kind of data sets that BGS hold, and specifically to sort of give you the access point to get hold of those. So I guess the most well-known fact about the BGS is that we hold the nation's borehole records. So we are a repository, a national repository for borehole records. The map there shows the kind of spread of boreholes. So each of the points on the map represents a borehole, and each of the colours represents a depth. So the red are the deepest boreholes that we've got in our collection there. The collection goes back about 150 years, so we've got some really early borehole records going back that far. And the data set also has a series of metadata attached to it. So it's got things like, obviously, its location and its depth, but start height, who drilled it, why it was drilled, that kind of stuff. So there's lots of information that you can find out using our GeoIndex, which we'll go on to talk about very shortly. The point here is, which kind of ties into the Dig to Share project, is that without continued donations to that borehole repository, then the whole thing loses its effectiveness, and eventually those borehole records will get older and older, and we have to constantly think about updating those records and trying to ingest as much information into the borehole repository as we can to keep it as current as possible. We also are very well known for our map data. So we have a suite of digital geological maps ranging from different scales. So the largest that we do rather is 10,000. The smallest that we do is 1 to 625, which is a kind of national coverage UK, broad brush scale geology. Our maps are also broken down into 4 themes, which we call bedrock, superficial, mass movements, so that's things like landslides, and then artificial, which is anything that is man-made. So embankments, cuttings, quarries, and landscape ground, that kind of thing all comes under that artificial banner. We have a couple of those are free, and they are both available as web map services. So the 50K scale data and the 625K scale data you can bring into any GIS, or you can access it via the web. So again, I'll show you that very shortly when we look at the GeoIndex. And we've got over 10,000 different lithological descriptions. So that's 10,000 individual geological units that are kind of recognized through our mapping from our survey mapping, and they've got different metadata attached to those as well. So this is the GeoIndex. So Dave and I have both talked about this already. So the GeoIndex is essentially your first port of call to get access to many of the data sets that BGS hold. I'm actually going to just flick out and do a live demo of this. So let's just see if this works. So this is actually the GeoIndex live, so I can move around and zoom in and zoom out quite easily just using the scroll wheel on my mouse. I can zoom in, for example, to where's our headquarters? Keyworth. Here we go. So this is our headquarters in Keyworth, which is that little building there. So it acts a little bit like a GIS map, so you can add data to it by clicking on this add data button just here. And then this gives you a list of all the data that we've got available within the GeoIndex system. So things like obviously geology, so you can turn geology on and off. So we've got 50K scale geology here, for example. So I'll just flick that on and you can see that the map changes instantly to reflect the fact that I want to investigate the geology. And if I click on any of these geological polygons, I get a little bit of metadata about that. So for example, this red polygon here is called the Branscombe Mudstone. And if I want to go one stage further and find out more about the Branscombe Mudstone, I can click on the more information. And I can get the full entry from our lexicon, which is it's like a dictionary essentially, which gives us an awful lot of detail actually about the Branscombe Mudstone, as you can see. I'll just go back. So yeah, so we can add more data. So let's add. I guess the next thing that anybody would add is borehole records. So we can click on our borehole records, and again, you can see that the map updates. I'm just going to. You can change transparency of these things. So just change the transparency of the geology so that it's slightly more see-through. And you can see that each of these dots here represents a borehole record. Again, the color indicates depth, but I must admit, I'm not sure what the scale is. But you can click on each of these boreholes and it will give you, again, a bit more information, a bit more metadata. So for example, we've got a reference number, we've got the name of the borehole, we've got a length, the date it was drilled, which is populated in most cases, an XY location, and then we've even got a link to the original scan of the data that was sent to us. So again, if we click on that scan, it will link us through to the kind of data that we hold as paper records, which has now all been scanned digitally and is available as PDF documents. So hopefully this should have some sort of geology. You can see the kind of quality that that we're faced with there, but you can kind of interpret that to as long as you know roughly what the driller was talking about. It gives you a good idea of what's in the ground.
It's worth saying, Steve, maybe that with that example, that what we've got there is a scan of the original driller's record. Well, in this case, it was a water well that did, may or may not have produced something. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a column called geological classification, and essentially this data came to BGS, and a geologist interpreted it, the lithostratigraphy or the stratigraphy on it. So it might say sandy head gravel, which is a superficial deposits. They've actually said, BCC, boulder clay, probably as a geological interpretation. So that's that's got the BGS stamp of approval on the side there. So when you're trying to work out what the actual geological formation units are, refer to that part.
Indeed.
And look at all the records, and you can see someone's also converted from depth on the depth column far right. They've converted from feet into metric. So 5.49 is equivalent to 18, the base of the unit, meters. So we've kind of added a little bit of kind of information, if you like, to some of these, and often hand scrawled, but that's kind of how to interpret that. Sorry, Steve.
Good. No, that's fine. Thanks, Dave. this list is quite extensive. I think there's over 150 different data sets in here. So obviously, we've already talked about geology. So we've got the 625 and the 50K data available free of, completely free within this system. We've got borehole records, and we've also got these AGS boreholes. So the AGS boreholes are particularly interesting and important to me. AGS is a data format created a fair number of years ago, about 10 or 11 years ago, I think, something like that, that was created essentially to standardize the borehole record and standardize the way that people store the data and record the data. So things like geological names, but also project numbers, project IDs, and borehole locations, that kind of thing. So the AGS provides a really formal and standardized way to record that information, which means that it's more accessible to other people wanting to use that data. It makes it much easier to ingest into different softwares, for example. If everything is in the same format, then it makes it easier to sort of transfer that data. So the Dig2Share project has capitalized on this and is encouraging more and more people to share their data in AGS format with the BGS, so that we can build on the repository, build on the quality of the repository using digital data, which means that sharing that data is even more easy to transfer to people using different forms of software. So at the minute, the borehole records contains I think it's 1,400,000 records. The AGS has got about 100,000, so we've got a way to catch up yet. But we're hoping that eventually more and more digital data will start coming into BGS through the AGS route. So if I just turn off the boreholes, you'll see an example of the AGS. So there we go. So those blue records, so the little blue dots here, represent the AGS data, and again we can click on one of those if we choose the right one, of course. So they're AGS boreholes. So in a similar way, it displays the metadata, and then we can see the record of that AGS data. So you can click on the log. So this is a log that's being generated on the fly from that digital data. So it's not actually stored as a log as the previous one was. This is actually digital data being displayed as a borehole log using a template. So that's slightly different to the borehole scans. But as I say, the AGS data and the borehole data should always be displayed together, so that you have a complete record of all the boreholes that have been drilled and deposited with the BGS. So it's important that those two items, if you like, should be switched on. We've also got there's tons of stuff in here. Photos.
Steve, I'd point people to the parent materials as well as the geology. Okay. We've got a kind of soil layer, which is parent materials is actually the parent material. It's a sort of soil term of it's at the base of the geology section.
Oh, sorry, yes. Oh, yeah.
So that might be useful for people doing shallow, horizontal,
material,
closed loop systems, slinkies. So to give you it's another kind of take on soil type.
Okay.
Which is it's kind of developed around more around the kind of agricultural industry, farmers and gardeners and stuff. But it might be useful to thinking about classifying a soil type. Sorry, Steve. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're
No, that's fine. Yeah. Thanks for chipping in, Dave. That's good. Yeah. So again, more metadata. So there's always some metadata attached to the data set, and we try and make sure that all that data is discoverable via the BGS website as much as possible. The other one we wanted to show was the Buried Valleys product, wasn't it? Yeah, you can see how much there is in here. Here we go. So modeled thickness of buried valleys is quite a useful one to show too. This is quite a new data set. So this was created last year. And essentially it shows well, obviously a buried valley is a glacial feature that is very rarely mapped on the surface, because these things, as their name suggests, are actually buried under different geological units, usually more superficial units. So it's easy to map superficial units, but not so easy to map the buried valleys, and they can be very deep. So particularly over towards East Anglia, for example, we've got some really thick deposits and really deep deposits hidden under the underneath the superficial cover, if you like. So that's a very useful data set to work with too.
Is there a coal mines layer in there, Steve? Questions just come up. Because obviously the coal authority is the principal source of coal mine information, but we do have some mapping with coal mines, extent of coal mine workings on.
I'm not sure. So there's open cast coal prospecting sites.
Might be in minerals. Open cast coal area. Historic mining.
Yeah,
so
active mines, open cast quarries, open cast coal licensing areas, mineral explorations, mineral veins. Could be worth. If anybody's really interested in that, perhaps we could dig that information out and get back to you on that one. It's a bit difficult.
There's some base of coal mine contours, so that there is a lot of information. There may be information in there that can help you identify what kind of depth there might be mine seams, or potential seams that could be exploited for coal mine geothermal heat, which is a big thing at the moment, using the warm water naturally sitting in abandoned flooded mines for very efficient ground source heating schemes, and there's quite a few projects going on at the moment all over the country. I think something like a third of the UK's houses sit above an coal mine. It's a third or a quarter. It's a figure I kind of read recently, and so there's massive potential for accessing water sitting in old mines for ground source heat pump schemes.
Cool.
And there's aquifer designations in there as well. So when you're looking at the risk, the potential kind of issues around where you might need to get sort of extra permission from the Environment Agency, which is easy enough, but it's just good to be aware of where the sort of groundwater protection zones, source protection zones, and some of that information is in there, and some of it's actually come from the Environment Agency. So we do try and share data sets with the Environment Agency and get them, make them easily accessible.
Very good. I'll just finish with by highlighting this section here, so deposited data. So deposited data is an area where since 2014, we've been storing our data. What's the right way to describe this? So for example, if a borehole record comes in as part of a site investigation report, the borehole itself is no longer kind of separated out and scanned as part of the process of ingestion, but the point itself will be logged using this point locations layer. So again, this could contain plenty of information for you to dig into, pardon the pun, and so it's always worth including deposited data point locations in your search for potential information for your site or for your project. I think we better move on a bit, actually, aren't we?
Yeah.
Let's flick back to the. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation. I'll just go through this, but essentially I've just done this live, so I'll just skip through this quickly. So we've already looked at adding data. These are the kind of things that you might have a look at. So this is the data that you might look at. You can zoom into an area. So this is again going into Keyworth, clicking on a borehole, click on the scan to access the information. And then, so borehole scans and AGS boreholes are the two things that I'd like to really press home, that those are vital bits of information that are useful for figuring out what's in the ground, essentially. The flip side of this, of course, is that if you have any data and you'd like to leave it with the BGS, then there is a deposit route for you to deposit your data with the National Geoscience Data Centre, which is the part of the organisation that looks after all of the records and preserves the records for the future. So it's a nice simple route. There's about 5 steps, I think, essentially you just give us contact details. There's a section where you can upload your, well, obviously upload your file, but talk about the confidentiality. So ideally we'd like all of the data coming into the BGS to be open, but we also appreciate the fact that some information is more sensitive than others, so we do offer a certain amount of confidentiality. So yeah, it's just a 5 or 6 step process, nice and simple, and then you can upload your file and feel good that you've sent information to the BGS for future generations to use. So this is just pressing home the point that GeoIndex provides access to many of BGS's data sets. Hopefully we've kind of shown you a few of those that are important. So, you know, map data, borehole data, both vital for understanding the subsurface. But as we've also seen on that list, there's an awful lot of data that we've got in there that we couldn't possibly show you in one small slot.
And yeah, I just wanted to press a point home that we've also got a Geology of Britain viewer, which is a similar sort of thing that a lot of people use, so it's another kind of web tool that we've got, but that's very much designed for sort of people to have a very quick look at the geology, more for kind of holiday geologists, I would say, because it's only got some very basic layers on it. So it's got the geology, the bedrock geology, the superficial, but it doesn't have that artificial or landslide geology, which could be important for your site. It doesn't. It does have the boreholes, but it doesn't have the AGS boreholes. So we'd really prefer professionals to be using GeoIndex. There's a lot more useful data in there. I mean, by all means, use whatever you feel comfortable with, but don't just use the Geology of Britain viewer. Also look at the GeoIndex if you want that extra level of information.
Yeah. That's good. Okay, so we've just got a small section on, I've called it traditional map data, so traditional in inverted commas, because obviously traditional maps are probably what everybody recognizes as paper maps, but these are our digital, well, our paper maps that have now been scanned and are available via the BGS website. So we have a BGS Maps portal available. You can search for maps on different regions or different subjects. So again, we've got all sorts of different maps available, different scales, different purposes. There's a couple of examples. So we just searched for maps for Nottingham, for example, and you can see the full list there. So there's different vintages, so different years of those maps. So it's the same sheet, but done in different ways, essentially. We can click through to the map record, so we can see the original metadata. And then we can click on the View Map button, which then takes us to the original map, which, these are very useful. These have slightly different information on them, which the digital maps, looking at the GeoIndex, for example, doesn't show you. So things like the cross sections, which people find, really useful to see how the geology stacks in the subsurface. And on the right hand side, you can just see the we call this the generalized vertical section. So this essentially is the youngest unit at the top and the oldest unit at the bottom, and it shows the relationship of the different geological units across the map in a kind of in a stylized way. These paper maps also, these digital paper maps, if you like, they also have things like dips and strikes, which aren't currently on our digital data, but those are being worked on. So that's something else to look out for. This is a slightly more up-to-date version of our map, but you can see that you can just kind of zoom in and out of the map, and you can get some fairly decent quality representation. I've already talked about the GVS at the top left and the cross section across the bottom there.
So I think a point with this is that UK geology is quite complex and interesting, but it can be quite varied from place to place, so even across one site. So these traditional, what used to be paper but are now available free online, which I think is fantastic. They provide that extra level of richness of information, because they can include cross sections which show you the kind of vertical slice through the ground. So I've just highlighted a box there in the lower left and the top left, which shows a typical site in perhaps somewhere like Waltham on the Wolds, which has got a cap of limestone and then mudstones. So there's about 4 or 5, 6 different types of geology under there. And you can see as you go, if you did a 200-meter deep closed loop borehole, you would actually encounter quite a bit of variety in geology. You may encounter several aquifers, which you could potentially use for open source schemes. You could use you can use the mudstones, which are tighter and have less water in them, for closed loop schemes. So it just gives you a better appreciation of the 3D kind of 2 or 3D kind of component of the ground.
Cool. Thanks,
Thanks,
Dave.
Steve.
So the next stage, or the next section rather, is to talk about 3D data. So we work extremely hard to make our data available in the third dimension, and we do that in a number of different ways. So we have different scales, so different resolutions of 3D data. So this is one example, looking at the whole country scale. So this is a product called the UK 3D model, which was based on our 625K data. I'll just flick through these. You can obviously read these as we're going through. It was developed by 23 geologists who all came together and constructed their sort of regional areas, and then me and a few colleagues managed the data and put it all together. It's all available free on the BGS website in a number of different formats. So if you're a 3D specialist, or even somebody who's interested in 3D generally, then have a look at that, because it's a fantastic resource. We, since 2004, have been collating all of our 3D model data into a database and into a web map, which hopefully will be available to an external audience through the GeoIndex, actually. So we're going to try and get that through this year. So that shows the kind of coverage of our 3D data that we've got within BGS. Some of this is licensable data, rather, so you can get your hands on it for a very small price. And we're also trying to push more and more data free out the door, because you know, free data engages people, and that's what we like. So a couple more examples, bringing it down to the sort of catchment or urban scale size model. So this is our London model that was released in 2014. It's got a series of different layers built into it, which I'm just, as you can see, just flicking off. So turning off the superficials, and you can see that we can dig down into the bedrock here. So this is now the top of the chalk with the alluvium shown over the top. So again, all of that data is currently licensable, and if you're the kind of person that works in 3D and likes to build 3D model data, then these surfaces can provide a really useful guide to, you know, even a site scale sort of model. You can purchase a few kilometers at a time, and yeah, just get in touch if you want to do that. Bringing it down to an even smaller, but down to the site scale. This is an example of a model that we did in the northwest of England at Knowsley Industrial Park. So we built a very small model, a very detailed model, in fact, looking at the superficial deposits sitting over the top of the aquifer, the Sherwood Sandstone aquifer. And we did this in conjunction with United Utilities, who supplied us their pipeline data. So we had 3D pipelines, combined it with the 3D geology, and we were able to do an assessment of the pipes to sort of indicate how vulnerable those pipes were to contamination of the aquifer, based on thicknesses of the clay deposits and how close they were to the Sherwood Sandstone aquifer. So it's quite a useful, a nice applied example that I always like to show. Dave, over to you for the open loop stuff.
Okay, so we're getting to the end of the presentation now. I think we'll just try and finish in the next few minutes, and then have time for some more questions and answers. So one of the neat tools we've got free online is the open loop screening tool, which is it was a collaboration project between the BGS and the Environment Agency. It was developed just about 8 years ago, I think, by my colleague Corinna Besse and the EA team. So essentially, it's an online tool. It sits in a different place on the website to GeoIndex. So I've included a link here. Yeah, so it's essentially a high-level screening tool to help you identify where there might be potential for open loop systems. So it's essentially sort of an aquifer hunting tool, and it's particularly developed with larger schemes in mind. So because it's mainly focusing, it's not looking at superficial aquifers, deposit aquifers, it's just looking at the main bedrock aquifer systems, really. So anything, if you want a larger scheme for a larger building or a district heating network, for instance, anything above a kind of 100 kilowatt thermal output capacity, you might be wanting to pump at least a litre a second, maybe 10 litres per second, 20 litres per second for a scheme like that. So this map's going to help you kind of identify from a very feasibility kind of stage where those decent aquifers might be, and whether your site's kind of, whether it's worth putting more energy perhaps into looking at, for a larger scheme, looking at an aquifer open loop system, or even an ATES system, aquifer thermal energy storage system. So it's based on 125,000 scale data, so it's not as kind of accurate, if you like, as the 50,000 scale mapping. It's based on 5 different layers. You've got a bedrock aquifer potential layer in there. You've got that sort of muddled together with a depth to the source layer, so depth to aquifer, which kind of is an indication of cost, drilling cost. It's got a protected area, so SSSIs, SPZs, which are source protection zones, information in there as well. That's modeled together with groundwater quality data around scaling, fouling, potential for that particular groundwater system, and also where there's existing license abstractions. So if you need, if you actually need to know, if you think, so this is kind of going to get you or your client thinking, well, maybe we could investigate this a bit more. So if you actually really are serious about taking forward an open loop system, then obviously we absolutely recommend you get a site-specific site investigation to understand the underlying geology, the expected yields, doing pump tests. You could get a BGS GeoReport to get, perhaps in the first step in that direction, to kind of work out what the typical, what existing data is in the area for pumping tests. But we'd recommend that you go to a qualified geological or hydrogeological consultant for that kind of next step. Here's an example of this open loop screening tool. So when you go in, again, it's a bit like GeoIndex. You've got this kind of screen, there's various layers, you can click on the layers, and when you click on the layer, it comes up with some metadata. So here's an example. I've taken a site near Nottingham, a place called Waltham on the Wolds, which we were looking at the geological map of earlier, and you can see there's light blue and dark blue areas. The light blue areas are termed favourable for larger open loop schemes, and the dark blue areas are sort of called non-favourable. So essentially it would be, there's kind of perhaps more constraints on the darker blue areas being not as good for open loop, but certainly closed loop would still work in those areas, whereas the light blue areas are going to be favourable for both closed loop and open loop. Both systems incredibly efficient. I think open loops particularly even higher efficiency than closed loop if done right. So you might want to kind of decide what suits your project best, but your consultant will help you decide and explore that, the options. And then if you want to sort of learn a bit more, you can drill down into the data and click on the individual layers that I mentioned, the 5 layers that it's made up from. So, and it'll give you a bit more information. So I've clicked on the image on the left is showing the bedrock aquifer potential, and I clicked on that and it's shown it's a good aquifer. We think it should, we'd estimate it should have at least 6 litres per second per borehole yield. So that we know would be good enough to heat quite a big building. Very efficiently indeed, probably COPs of 4 or 5 on that. So you could also use it for cooling, potentially, very efficient cooling system if you need a cooling. So the second map is the depth to source, so that shows that it's less than 50 meters until you hit that aquifer, which is going to make your drilling cheaper. And it's got the far right shows the source per section zones, and actually in the area we're looking at here there isn't any source per section zones, but I've clicked on a site about 10 kilometers to the east, and there is a source protection zone there. So again, it will give you a feel for kind of what's around, and you can start thinking, if I start pumping water, would it potentially be too close to a source protection zone, or is it far enough away that, you know, it's not going to kind of be too much of an issue to convince the EA it's a good idea. And I kind of wanted to touch really what, in terms of urban ground source heating, I think that's kind of the next going to be a really big thing in the future. District heating systems, 4th and 5th generation district heating using either central heat pump centers or individual heat pumps in homes and ultra low temperature water distribution systems is kind of getting interesting in the UK now. And it's been done for years in sort of the Nordic countries and Germany and Holland really well. So we're really starting to pick up on these types of projects in the UK. And I've got an example here I wanted to share with a geothermal opportunity map we produced for Cardiff as a kind of example. So this map shows the thickness of a superficial deposit aquifer in Cardiff, which is being used to heat a school using an small open loop heat pump. And this map's kind of intended to show kind of energy town planners and consultants like what the kind of geological opportunities are in terms of ground source heat pump systems. So it shows kind of two main areas. One area is where you could get away with open and closed loop systems, which will both work really well. And area zone 2 is where there isn't a good kind of shallow aquifer, so you'd be mainly looking at closed loops in those systems. So it just gives a bit more information. And just to finish off with, Steve had a slide on Groundhog Desktop. Steve, can you just wrap up?
Yes, I'll just yeah, I think I'll let people read what's on the slide there, but just to say that Groundhog is a product that we've developed at the BGS. Essentially, it is a product that allows you to bring in borehole data either from the BGS or from your own databases. You can pull in different web map services, load your own images. You can bring in things like shape files, and you can string your boreholes together to construct cross sections. So if you're the kind of person within your organization that is drawing cross sections to look at how the geology changes along a site, then Groundhog could be very useful for you to sort of convert that into a digital workflow, in which case please get in touch, because I'm more than happy to talk a bit more about Groundhog, and maybe we could organize if there's enough interest in Groundhog, we could organize a separate demonstration of that.
Thanks, Steve.
I think that will.
Yeah.
What we do.
So I think to wrap up, you can see there's a range of geological data available from BGS. Quite a lot of it's for free and online and easier than ever to access, and some of it's more bespoke for sort of a small fee. We hope you've learned something from this seminar, and we're always available. You know, you can drop us a line or an email and we can try and answer your questions, or we can certainly find someone who can. And yeah, I think we just want to reiterate that, you know, ground source heating and cooling is, you know, a very exciting technology for decarbonising our heating and cooling grid. And, you know, I think the UK is in a good position in that we do know a lot about the subsurface. You can see from this presentation, we've got a lot of data, and it's growing. That body of data is growing all the time. And so that, you know, helps us sort of decide how best to design the ground side of ground source heating and cooling schemes. So perhaps we'll pass over to the moderator now for, so we've run over a little bit. So there's a few questions, I think, on the group chat, so we're happy to kind of answer some of those, I think.
Yes, so
Laura?
thanks to both of you for the presentation. It was really useful, and also having the live demo has been really useful as well.
Oh, good. That's good.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are a few questions. A couple of them are sort of along the same lines, so I'm just going to read a couple of those. First of all, I wanted to know, was very early on, do people have to declare their boreholes by law, and how would they know to do this? Because I sometimes work with domestic people who have had a borehole put in and haven't even been told they need to register that. And then we had a further question about clarifying whether drillers and site owners are obliged to log data for all boreholes. Sue Roper then wrote something on there about how the Mining Industry Act and Water Resources Act requires notification of drilling over 30 metres and 15 metres.
Yeah.
And then the follow-on question from that was, how is that being policed? And, you know, I think we've all got experience of people having boreholes drilled. Nobody's registered them. They didn't even know they had to register them. And somebody else will come along and put another borehole in the ground, not even knowing that there's a borehole there already.
Yeah, and sometimes you could reuse an old borehole and save yourself a ton of money as well on a project. So, I mean,
yeah, that's kind of the reason that the Dig to Share project was brought about, really, is to ensure that we try and collect as much data as possible. So we kind of estimated that something like 80% of boreholes weren't deposited with the BGS, which, as Sue quite rightly says, the Mining Act and the Water Extraction Act, they both require people to deposit their data with the BGS, as long as it's deeper than something like 30 meters, I think it is, or 25 meters, something like that. Sue might be able to just double check that for me.
Yeah, so it's open loop schemes over 15 meters deep.
Okay, sorry, yeah, okay.
I think.
Right, okay.
Shallow open loops wouldn't be, but if you're abstracting more than 20 meters cubed a day, you know, you would have to get an abstraction license from the EA. And if it's often they're non-consumptive, so they're actually injecting back into the aquifer, or maybe a sewer, well, probably a pond or a lake or something.
Yeah.
In which case that would be consumptive. But if you're going back into the aquifer, I think there's several steps that a consultant can take you through, and you know, they'll sort all that side of it out. And it's just got easier to license smaller schemes, I think, with the EA. So there was some information in John Finlay's talk about that previously. So all these things can be overcome, I think. And no one, I don't know if the EA, I can't really comment whether the EA police, how much they police it. We don't police it, really, to be honest.
No,
I think
that's right.
We can't, because if we don't know you drilled it, we can't police it. So
absolutely,
we don't have the resource to do that.
There's nothing to say, there's nothing in law that says if you have a borehole drilled, you must declare it somewhere. There's nothing like that. It's up to the driller, or it's up to the client to know that they should really do that.
They should know that. So for mineral holes, you know, there is an act, that they should be declaring it above a certain depth.
Yeah, and the same with the water.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve. One of the issues with closed loop boreholes, they're typically 100 meters deep, and they could provide a large amount of data on the strata and water strikes, but we don't generally receive, because they're not sort of registered. We don't receive any, we don't know where they are. We don't. They could provide a lot of useful data for other schemes in the area. And for sort of research purposes. So we'd encourage people drilling closed loops, if they do a test well or something, and they do get some drillers logs, to give them to us, and we can add them back into that map system for you, so you can kind of find the data. And we are talking to MCS about whether we could add map layers that show where the MCS installers schemes are. So you might be able to sort of find out whether there's a scheme nearby your site, because that could potentially you'd want to kind of avoid thermal interactions between sites if they're really close together. So we're kind of trying to think innovatively about how we can provide even better information for the ground source heat pump community there.
Thank you.
Sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's right. That's fine.
Peter McConvey's given you a question. Is there much thermal properties data held from TRTs, etc., as a searchable data set, or are there separate reports for that?
Steve?
I don't think, I think the thermal data would be held within the reports. That's not really anything that's kind of stripped out and held separately. However, if that data came through as an AGS file, then I think that kind of data, that kind of test data, would be available in the AGS file.
Yeah, I don't think it
could
would
be.
be, Steve. So
Oh,
I don't
sorry.
think
Okay.
AGS. Yeah, so thermal response tests are quite sort of specific.
Right.
So
Okay. Okay.
get a
Sorry.
thermal response test if you it's the best way to find out what the performance of the ground's going to be like at your site in terms of the heat extraction rates you can expect for your scheme. So it's actually an in situ test. So there is some information. The BGS provides some estimated thermal conductivities based on research work that's been done over the last 30 years for different geologies, and that's kind of some of the information you could get from buying one of our GeoReports, for instance. We don't actually have, I don't think, any TRT test data, because that's generally held by the industry or the clients, and those reports perhaps get, they probably get put on a shelf somewhere and not really given to us. So we would love people to give us TRT test results, and we could find a way to try and get them registered in the National Geological Data Centre. So you can't search for TRT data sets at the moment, unfortunately. But if that's something that you think you would like to be able to do as an industry, then let's keep talking about it.
Yeah,
And maybe we can find a way.
I think this is the great thing about these webinars, is that we find out all sorts of things like this, and there's no reason why I don't think the GSHPA members could, there's probably a lot of information held by GSHPA members, and if we can get it over to you to make it better for everybody and understanding the strata, then all the better, really. So yes, definitely we should keep talking about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just Ian Howley has said thanks. He says, thanks, very useful. You should be proud of the website. It helps us enormously.
That's good to hear.
Good comment for you. Just a quick question from me. Does BGS offer consultancy services? When you talked about the Cardiff project, would you just point people to a website, or do you actually do consultancy on jobs like the Cardiff job? So
the Cardiff job was a research project funded by the Innovate UK. So we do consultancy. Occasionally people come to us. It's often for, if you've got a big site or a number of sites and you want to sort of do a screening study of what the geothermal potential might be, the geology, strata, the structure. If you've got a site with complex geology, lots of faults and folds where, trying to guess what issues you might get in the ground, it could be a bit more tricky. You might want a bit more involvement of sort of a BGS geologist. Then yeah, absolutely, we can offer those things. You can kind of get in touch with me or BGS inquiries, and they'll put you through to the relevant person.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Well, we're just running out of time, but there's just a couple more. If anybody else has got any questions, just quickly jot them down. But there was one up here. So even would you agree that looking at the BGS website and the different data sets, especially the ones that you've shown today, is that a good starting point for a project? But it doesn't get away from still needing to do ground surveys and getting out to site and doing actual TRTs and things.
Yeah, I would say that it's a great starting point for your desk study, which should be the first thing you're doing when you're looking at a new site. So get all the information together you can. There will be reports and things that we just don't have. So you kind of, it's part of trawling around for the available information. But absolutely, you can see that there's a limit to the scale of information we can provide, because we provide national, or kind of city scale data sets generally. There is some site specific data in there with the boreholes, but if there's not a borehole near your site, then you absolutely need to employ a reputable, experienced, qualified consultant who has the right skill sets within their team for your project. And although BGS can provide estimated thermal conductivity values, again, they're estimations based on a limited amount of data, and I think they won't. It's a very useful starting point if it's a small project and you can't afford a TRT test. It's probably it's part of the information your designer will use to make some judgments about how the ground will perform. If you've got groundwater flow going through the site, those estimated values that we provide in our GeoReports, for instance, won't, there'll be an underestimate. There'll probably be a conservative estimate generally of how the ground behavior. So you actually might expect usually even better performance than perhaps just based on the estimated values that we provide. So yeah, always get an expert on board early on, get a geologist on board early on in your project, and you'll have a successful project.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And then just one other question just popped up. We talked earlier very briefly about the Mining Industry Act and Water Resources Act and about notification of drilling operations. Do the acts cover closed loop boreholes, or is it just open loop?
No, they don't cover closed loop, and heat is not regulated in the UK at the moment. So it's something that's starting to be discussed more at government level. And the Ground Source Heat Pump Association is a voice within that. Yes. It's an actor within that discussion, as is BGS, as is the EA. So yeah, we're all talking to each other, which is why we don't know where the closed loop systems are. And so if you were to put one in, yeah, we're actually, what we started in Cardiff is a register of heat pump systems. So just as a kind of tester to see if it's useful, because we think by kind of collating that information, you know, people going in and designing, so we can avoid a kind of first come first serve approach to accessing the heat in the ground. Mm-hmm. You know, I think if we start to map where the existing schemes are, then everyone can share heat fairly, if you like. So yeah. I think that's going to be part of the future of where the future research and collaboration with the industry is going as well.
Excellent, that's great. It's actually, like you said before, you know, it is exciting times and things are changing quite a lot, but for the better, hopefully. So
yeah, we've got to reach net carbon zero carbon by 2050. So
well, yes,
let's get on and install renewable energy systems across the board, I think. Yeah,
definitely. Well, thank you very